The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
We do need church. We do need these life-giving communities, and there are life-giving communities out there, no matter how we might have been burnt by Christians in the past. Because I've been in many situations in my life where I can't pray. I need someone to pray for me. You know, I can't worship God. I need someone to worship for me.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Glen Scrivener is the director of Speak Life, a UK-based organization that shows the love of Jesus through creative communication. He's a speaker, a producer of online content, and the author of several books. His latest book is The Air We Breathe, How We All Came to Believe in Freedom, Kindness, Progress, and Equality. In it, Glen makes the case that Western culture isn't as post-Christian as we may have thought. Glen Scrivener, I am very happy to have you on the Habit Podcast today.
Hey, thank you for having me.
And so you just this, I think it was just this summer, or at least this year, published a new book called The Air We Breathe. And the idea, why don't you tell us what the idea of this book is?
Well, in 2019, Tom Holland came out with a book called Dominion, which is a big fat book about the history of Christianity and how it has shaped the modern world. And his big thesis there was that one of the marks of the success of the Jesus Revolution is that we don't notice it. We are like goldfish, and Christianity is the water that we swim in. And it's a terrific read, and he's a sensational writer. But it's 600 plus pages. Right. And I remember giving it to my father-in-law for Christmas, and I got Tom Holland to sign it. And it was the perfect Christmas present because my father-in-law loves history, and yet it sits there on his shelf and it still remains unread. And so one of the great desires of my heart is that my father-in-law will read Dominion for Dummies, AKA The Air We Breathe.
Yeah. Okay. By the way, I listened to that book on the audiobook while I had some enormous yard project, and I listened to it while I did that, and it took hours and hours. But I just love that book.
Oh, sure, it must have done. Yeah.
And I appreciate your putting the cookies on a little bit lower shelf here, or the biscuits, maybe I should say.
I understand.
If that's more helpful. Yeah. So you make the case that somehow Christianity has gotten the reputation as being an enemy or a hurdle to contemporary Western values like equality and compassion and consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, progress. I think those are your chapters, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, those are the core 7 values that I discussed. Yeah.
And but you make the case that it's not far from being a barrier to these things. Christianity is the very basis of these values that we think of as modern Western values.
Yeah, sure. And you can see that by if you just reverse those 7 values, you get something that is unequal, cruel, non-consensual, unenlightened, anti-science, restrictive, and regressive. And what does that sound like? That sounds like the worst. If anything is the opposite of those 7 values, we think of it as being the worst. Well, why is that? It's because these 7 values are transcendent values. They are the best. But the other interesting thing is, what is it that we first of all think is described by being unequal, cruel, coercive, etc.? It's the church, right? And we live within the Jesus Revolution, and we are children of the revolution. And what do children do? They kick against their parents, and they think they're being incredibly rebellious.
Yeah.
But all along, you get to a certain age. I'm in my 40s now, and the other day I opened my mouth, and my father came out. And you just think, oh no, it's happening. And it always happens. And I think we're all starting to notice Tom Holland is just one of many secular thinkers who has started to see, human rights and equality. They don't come from the Enlightenment. They don't come from the assured findings of reason and science. They come from Christianity. And I therefore think pressing into that has huge potential for showing that our secular friends are perhaps not as secular as they thought, and that maybe they are already believers. And we just need to point them to the one who makes sense of those beliefs.
Yeah. You draw a distinction between Christianish values and Christianity, right? And you say in Western cultures, people have Christianish values.
Yes.
Why is that a helpful distinction?
Well, I'm not saying, I'm certainly not saying that anyone born in the West is by default a Christian believer. What I am saying is that the moral imagination of people born in this part of the world has been shaped just irrevocably by the Jesus Revolution. And it's Christian-ish in that, for instance, that first value that I talk about, equality, Galatians 3:28 says, we are all one in Christ Jesus. What has happened over the course of political and moral philosophy is that we've kind of secularized that truth and detached it from its origins in Christianity. And now it's not so much that we're one in Christ, it's that we are equals in society. And that starts to have a different flavor to it. Oneness involves kind of bonds of communion and love and self-sacrifice. Equality and rights starts to be about my privileges and me as an atomized individual. And so where the biblical vision is really that we are all equally welcome at the same table, I think the modern secular Christian-ish version of it is that we ought to all be equally far up our own individual ladders. Now, we never would have got that idea of equality without the Jesus Revolution, but we've traveled some distance from Galatians when we start to be individuals and individualistic, and that's just one of the examples of the ways in which we've detached these Christian values, and that they are now recognizably Christian-ish, but not Christian.
Yeah. At one point, and you can help me out if I misparaphrase you, but you say, when we want the kingdom without the king, we dethrone Jesus and put their abstract values.
Yes.
And values can't forgive. They can only judge. Only a person can forgive. Yes. Values can only judge. I thought it was a really interesting insight.
Well, it explains so much of why it is that a very secular society is also very judgmental.
Yeah.
The Dostoevsky quote, without God, everything is permissible. That's you can understand why a society detached from traditional religion might become more permissive. But what we're noticing is that we're not so much a permissive society; we're even more puritanical. we've got even more purity tests for people. We want to excommunicate people. We want to declaim them as heretics and put them outside of the camp, where we are now incredibly preachy, not permissive.
Yeah.
Why is that? Well, it's because we've got the values of the kingdom, but not the king. And that's a horrible kind of semi-Christianity to have only the values of the kingdom, and not the king himself, in whom those values are so evident, and who can, it's bizarre, really, to prize compassion in the abstract. The reason why we love compassion is because there was one person called kindness himself. In Titus chapter 3, the kindness and love of God appeared. Titus 3 verse 4. Jesus is kindness himself. He is compassion himself. These values, they have a person at their heart. When you divorce the person from it, they become abstract and they become judges. And then at that point, have I been compassionate? Well, not as compassionate as I could have been. What do I do about that? Well, in one sense, I could become contrite and humble and perhaps seek greater compassion. Or much better is I can point the finger at some other guy and say, he's much worse than I am. And this is what we've got. We're just hurling accusations at each other. I say, the culture wars are we're hurling Bible verses at each other. We've just forgotten the references.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's good. So these insights, I mean, you're talking about the fracturing, the fragmentation of public discourse. Any thoughts on how these insights help writers, people who do creative work, communicate in a culture that is so fractious?
Well, I think in these crisis moments, you could think of 410 AD and the Visigoths sack Rome, and you just think, well, that's the end of the world, isn't it? It would have seemed like the end of the world to a Roman citizen. The eternal city has been overturned. And yet, what is the response to that? You get an Augustine in North Africa writing The City of God and writing millions of words of theology, but also of, music theory and legal theory and philosophy and all sorts. And out of that cultural crisis emerges this great desire to reimagine how society can be based around the city of God and not the city of man. And I wonder if there's a similar opportunity at the moment when the city of man is so fractured and so divided. Is there hope for political unity in the United States? Let's ask. Gosh, it's very difficult to be hopeful about discovering unity at the political stage. Well, put yourself in the sandals of a North African who looks over the Mediterranean and sees Rome sacked. That is an even more cataclysmic event. And yet what we saw was Christendom was kind of built out of the ruins of those sorts of tragedies. And it was the imagination of an Augustine and just the incredible turn of phrase that he had, the mind. It's often said that, the entire Western Church lives inside Augustine's head. Even the Protestant Catholic divide, it's Augustine's doctrine of the church versus Augustine's doctrine of grace. Who's going to win? But there are opportunities at these crisis moments for the great thinkers, the great writers to step forward and cast a vision that is of the eternal city and not of the fractured human political societies.
Yeah, I have really loved The City of God these last few years. It's been a lot of time dipping in, I won't say reading straight through, but dipping in and it's been a really helpful book for me lately. On the other hand, I'm not Augustine. Right?
Yep.
And you said this is a time for the great writers to step up. I agree. What about those of us who maybe you're just good writers or just writers?
Just writers. Yeah. Like the Glen Scriveners of the world. The cut price Tom Hollands of this world. Yeah. Like me. I mean, when you see, for instance, in church history, how did the gladiatorial games get overturned. There was legislation, but it went hand in hand with the lives of the saints, the lives of like a monk like Telemachus, who went into the Colosseum and he just wanted to stop the blood sports. And so he jumped the fence and got into the arena and stood between the two gladiators trying to stop the bloodshed. The gladiators didn't know what to do. The crowd did. They stoned him to death. And you just think, what a loser. Mm-hmm. What good is that? And yet news of the martyrdom of Telemachus, reaches the emperor's ears, and he overturns he bans the gladiatorial games. Or you think of a saint like Macrina, who in the 4th century would just tour the rubbish dumps where the Romans would routinely cast off their children, especially their little girls and their disabled children, to be exposed to die. And she started a movement of saving the children and building the orphanages. And you think of a preacher like a Frederick Douglass, who he is an enslaved man who adopts the religion of his enslaver, but understands it, and transcends both his slavery and his slave master in his knowledge of Christ. And you just see throughout church history these people living for Christ, and some of them are quite ignominious, and it has just been the little acts of the compassion, equality, consent, etc. It's been the little acts of faithfulness that has brought about the revolution.
Yeah, I love it. I like the distinction you draw between the song and the singers. Right? You say Jesus gave us this beautiful song that we've often sing out of tune. And yet, as you say, if you've truly heard the song, you can't get it out of your head.
Yes. And I got that from John Dixon, who wrote Bullies and Saints, which shares a lot of the same themes as my book and as Dominion. He interestingly, Tom Holland wrote a commendation of John Dixon's book, and he said it's apologetic apologetics. It is saying, sometimes the church has been the worst, morally, ethically, spiritually, and just owning that. And so his great illustration throughout is that Jesus gave us a great song to sing. We sing it badly at times, but the song remains true. And I use that all the time when I'm talking to people about these issues, because often the brickbats get thrown at Christians, and what about the Crusades, and what about the Inquisition, et cetera, et cetera. And I just find that a really helpful little analogy.
Yeah. I think it's very freeing, to think I don't have to be a genius. I don't have to be original.
Right.
If God grants that I am original at some point, well, good. But if I can just give an account of the hope that's within me, that's worth a lot.
Yeah. And you're referencing 1 Peter 3, verse 15, which is sort of the verse about apologetics. It's where the word apologia comes from. Always be prepared to give an answer, an apology, to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that you have. And interestingly, that verse certainly that word has led to a conception of apologetics as a very philosophical enterprise in which I memorize Aquinas' 5 arguments for the existence of God, and I'm able to download them on somebody, ready or not. Here come Aquinas' 5 ways. Whereas in its context, you've got these bedraggled refugees in 1 Peter who are strangers and exiles in the world. They're just barely clinging on by their fingernails. Yeah. And it's the idea of other people asking them, how are you still standing after the year you've just had? And the apologetic that you give at that point is not a very erudite philosophical argument. The apology you give at that point is, I don't know how I've gotten through. Somehow Jesus has carried me.
Yeah.
And that's brilliant apologetics in its own. That is apologetics, 1 Peter style. It's interesting how far we've come.
Yeah, I know. I remember, as a young and overly serious man, thinking I was on the hook for somehow needing to be able to rattle off something on the basis of that verse.
Yes.
And in a sense, realized that just giving an account of something beautiful in the world, that counts too, of giving an account of the hope that's within me.
So I'm an evangelist, and I go around and churches will ask me to help train people in personal evangelism. And I give them all sorts of sort of sentences up your sleeve that you can have. And one is, that's what I love about Jesus, ... Finish the sentence. Or that's what I love about my church, ... How do you finish that? But then the one that's very 1 Peter 3 is, I couldn't have gotten through X without Jesus. What is X for you? And you start talking like that, you're about to have a very rich conversation.
Yeah, that's good. I also, while we're on the subject of the song and the singer, I appreciate this formulation of yours, which maybe you borrowed from somebody else, but you can give credit
Probably.
if need be. You said we can't survive on the memory of a tune. We need it sung to us.
Yes.
And
yes.
I think that formulation is a big encouragement to people who write, who make music, who do art. The idea that we're just singing this song to people who need more, who need to be reminded.
Yes. And it means we need community, and we need a worshiping community that can hold us and carry us when we can't carry ourselves. So I write the book. I explicitly say this is for the nuns, the duns, and the ones. So that the nuns are the NONESs, those who reply on a survey, do you have a religion? No, none. But the duns are those who are done with Christianity, and perhaps they're deconstructing. And my real burden for them is, yes, you can't survive on the memory of a tune. You need it sung to you. Are you able to find a community that you can trust again to sing that song to you? It is not enough to simply throw the church under the bus and say the church has been terrible for 2,000 years, but the singer of the original song, Christ, is great. We do need church. We do need these life-giving communities, and there are life-giving communities out there, no matter how we might have been burnt by Christians in the past. So that's really my burden of because I've been in many situations in my life where I can't pray. I need someone to pray for me. I can't worship God. I need someone to worship for me. I'm an Anglican, so the whole idea of liturgy holding you and said prayers. I don't find that to be, going through the motions. I think there are motions that are being given to us to go through because we're bodily creatures. There are motions that are meaningful, and to be carried by those can be really helpful.
Yeah. Right. I mean, I was specifically applying that idea to writing and art making, but that's really a relatively small piece of the pie when it comes to singing the song to one another, right? It's a small and not the most important piece of the pie or the biggest piece of the pie. It is the piece of the pie that I'm especially interested in, but as you say, we're telling this truer story to each other in a lot of different ways.
And we need to be immersed in something bigger than us. As well. Here's another problem with apologetics in the sort of the modernistic sense. It's a very rational enterprise where you think your way towards the kingdom, and beauty is just something you cannot reason with. The heart has its reasons, etc. So there is something about being immersed in something that you do not understand and you cannot wrap your head around, but it transcends you and you know it, which is a real antidote to a lot of evangelical evangelism. Tends to operate as though there's a great cathedral there called Christianity, and the evangelist is outside the cathedral with a little pamphlet, and it's got a thumbnail sketch of the cathedral that explains how the cathedral was put together and how the cathedral works, because that's what you really need to understand. You really need to understand how the whole thing fits together, and it needs to be explained to you. Whereas to have the song sung to you, to be immersed in the arts, is to have someone grab you by the hand and yank you into the cathedral, and you don't know what's going on. You don't know how those flying buttresses are keeping the ceiling up. You don't know how this part of the building relates to that part of that. Doesn't matter though. There's something that art can do in immersing us in just a grander vision. And it's such a healthy antidote to, I think, a modernistic apologetic that actually doesn't work.
Yeah. Flannery O'Connor talks about the idea that in a story, meaning is an experience and not an abstraction that you can then pull out. If you could just pull that meaning out, you wouldn't need to write the story. You could just give, and that feels similar to what you're saying about the cathedral and the faith. Right.
Yeah, it's like the T.S. Eliot, he reads a poem publicly and somebody says, "Can you explain the poem?" So he reads the poem again. And then someone asks him, "No, but really, can you explain it?" So he reads it a third time.
Yeah, that'll learn them.
Yeah, no, there's something definitely about that. And in the Anglican tradition that I'm from, there are services of just scripture that is said to you and sung to you, and you get a lot of Bible actually in these services. And maybe the choir is doing some of the praying and some of the singing and some of the scripture reading, and maybe you're not as involved as you might like to be, but it is again that sense of being carried by something bigger than you, which is what faith is. Like, faith is dependence, right? Mm-hmm. We've turned it into decision. Faith is decision. No. Faith is dependence. Lots of things unfold from that fork in the road. So many people conceive of faith as decision, and decision theology kind of unfolds in a certain direction. Faith as dependence goes in a very different direction, and a much healthier one.
I want to ask about another. I'm now changing the subject, Glenn.
Okay.
So we're still talking about your book, though. You talk about the idea that Jesus never suffered anxiety regarding the size or the prospects of his movement, that what he was interested in was distinctiveness. As you say, there's a phrase, the peculiar proved to be potent, right? The focus for Jesus, the focus of the Jesus revolution, let's say, is a distinctiveness. And we can, what I took from that is we can let the techniques and the platforms and these kind of things take care of themselves.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear you say more about that idea of peculiarity, distinctiveness, and why that is so important.
Yeah, well, so to my three audiences, I say to the nuns, you don't need to leap. You don't need to take a leap of faith. You just need some ground beneath your feet, because you're already midair. And only Jesus will do. And I say to the duns, what do I say to them? I say something very profound.
I'm sure it was something.
Obviously.
Yeah, great. I mean, not quite as good as what Tom Holland would have said, but great.
Yeah, that's right. Something pithy and memorable about to the duns. But then to the ones is be weird. And you just see again and again in the history of the church, what they're saying doesn't make any sense. So pederasty, for instance, I write a chapter on the sexual revolution of the first few centuries. Because the sexual revolution that's built our world, happened about 1900 years earlier than the swinging 60s. And in that situation, there's 25 Latin words for prostitute. And there's no natural way of referring to an adult male virgin in Latin. You just can't do it. If you say virgin, you just mean a woman. You could not possibly mean a man virgin. and a trip to the brothel would set you back the price of a loaf of bread, and they were state sponsored, and wow. Therefore the armies have to go and enslave other nations and women in order to keep the sexual economy going. And pederasty is celebrated as, usually an older man initiating a younger man into sexual rituals. And it was called pederasty, which means child love. And it was really weird for Christians to come along and be virgins. That's incredibly weird. It was incredibly weird to have especially men to restrict their sexual appetites and behaviors so that they were to be chaste in the exact same way that women were chaste, and to attack that double standard. We realize how weird it was, because when Peter is told about the marriage and family program of Jesus in Matthew chapter 19, he says, "Oh, if this is the case, it would be better if we weren't married." He says, "As a married man." We are not told what Mrs. Peter thought about his interjection at this point. Red-blooded men looked at the sexual revolution and naturally said, "Yikes. You mean marriage is one man, one woman, the doors are locked, no one gets out alive? Are you serious?" And Jesus, well, yeah. Or you could be a eunuch for the kingdom. Those are your two options. And the absolute revolution in values was extraordinary. And the Greco-Roman world could not wrap their heads around Christians who would not go along with the sexual tide and who would resist the sexual tide. And therefore, to be a virgin was to be a rebel and to actually show the possibility for free will. I mean, it's very interesting when you look in the early centuries about how fatalistic, the Greco-Roman world was, and you look at Greek tragedies, and you know it's going to unfold into a catastrophe at the end, and there is no way out. And actually, where do we get the idea of free will from? Kyle Harper has written a brilliant book called "From Shame to Sin" about the sexual revolution of the early centuries, and he said, the front edge of the Christian view of free will butted up against the world over the issue of sex, and Christians vowing chastity was the most incredible flag raised for freedom. Yeah, which we find that difficult to, surely freedom means being liberated, and being liberated means being licentious. But no, the great revolution was chastity. The great revolution was, okay, we're not going to call it pederasty anymore. We're going to call it paidaphthoros, which means child destruction. What the Romans called love, we will call abuse. Yeah. And it was weird, and it was totally cutting against the grain, but its weirdness was its witness, and the peculiar proved potent. We don't need to be the same as the world. And I say that very clearly at the end of the book, because what I don't want people to think is, because the world is Christian-ish, therefore the church should be world-ish. I'm not saying the world should be church, the church should be world-ish at all. We should keep doing our bonkers thing of following Jesus and being weird. That is where the revolution happens.
Wow. Well, that's good stuff. I typically end with this question, so what I'm going to ask you now. Who are the writers who make you want to write?
I love poetry with a punch. Gerard Manley Hopkins is probably my favorite writer, really, and poet.
Do you read his letters and his prose? Do you read those too?
No. Have you?
I've kind of poked around. I go back to the poems whenever I try to read the letters. I go back to the poems pretty quickly.
Yeah, I've got a volume of his poetry, which I just go back to, and just the polishing of words to become jewels is just extraordinary. And just as jewels are kind of stones glorified, poetry is prose glorified, and just raised to that level. And it speaks to me because I've got monkey mind, and I don't know. I haven't had a diagnosis of ADHD. I wouldn't be surprised if someone slapped a diagnosis of that on me. I'm incredibly scatterbrained, and therefore I need the punchy. I need to be grabbed by the throat. And it would kill me to think that I'd written a plodding page. It would. I'm sure I've written many, but the idea of writing plodding prose absolutely kills. I have absolutely no patience for it when I read. I discard books left, right, and center. Like, no, sorry. You lost me. I gave you 30 pages. That's
right.
I'm out.
It's the author's job to keep your attention, not your job to pay attention, right?
Yes, I like that. Yeah, no, absolutely. And was it Kurt Vonnegut's? Oh, what does he say? Something like write in such a way that, that you're begging the indulgence of a perfect stranger. Always bear that in mind. You're begging the indulgence of a perfect stranger. So get to the point.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. But yeah, anything that anything that is sharp prose that hits me that punches me in the guts and grabs me by the throat and says, look again. This is what I try to do, because I just have no patience for anything else, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, Glen Scrivener, thanks so much. And thanks for writing this book. I have high hopes for it. I hope a lot of people read it and benefit from it. So thanks for being here, and thanks for writing this book.
Hey, absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. To check out more of our podcasts, visit rabbitroom.com/podcast. Our work at The Rabbit Room would be impossible without the generous support of our membership. If you'd like to learn more about membership at The Rabbit Room, visit rabbitroom.com/member. And thanks for listening.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.